Welcome back to another episode of Power of the Mind, where we give you simple tools to improve your relationship with yourself and with others. Today we're going to talk about trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll spend some time discussing domestic violence and some of the impacts that those things have on our lives. Hope you enjoy.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into Talking Glass Media Cast 11, Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare.
Hello.
Hey, Greg. How's it going?
It's going great.
All right. A little heavy right now. We're talking about PTSD.
PTSD, yes.
Yeah. It's no bueno.
It's a tough one. It's a real challenge to be a human being sometimes, and particularly if you've been a human being who's experienced some really severe trauma. Yeah, PTSD is really challenging.
So after we recorded our segment last time, it just got me kind of thinking. And I've worked in, healthcare settings to where you're working with senior citizens or people who have gone through wars and been in those situations. And I noticed, and probably I didn't notice, I was, that wasn't my job to notice, but we were made aware that, some of our residents would get sundowners. And so as the sun would start going down, started getting dark, we knew that there was going to be an outburst or a recollection of a wartime period.
Yeah.
And it was funny because with Alzheimer's or dementia, you can't always remember what you had for breakfast, but the past is so there.
Right. And
so for somebody who's been in that traumatic experience in their life, I see them kind of reliving that quite a bit.
Yeah, it's a flashback, a full immersion flashback. Yeah.
I never figured out the best way to help this.
That's a complex question, So we actually all have flashbacks with great regularity. If you have any kind of trauma at all, you'll often have a flashback, but most of us have flashbacks that aren't completely immersive. Right. So we talked before about the idea of the sense of smell, or that's actually one of the most common ones. Or, of course, taste, touch, visual type stuff, all those different pieces that come back when a person has a flashback. But a fully immersive flashback is a real challenge. And what you're talking about there is a nervous system that has just been really, really compromised, taken beyond its capacity. And so any kind of stimulus that reminds the person of the experience will often result in them losing touch with the present and kind of getting buried back in the previous experience. I've always suspected that part of the underlying motivation of the nervous system is to find some sort of resolution. And of course, that resolution never comes.
Right.
So that's the challenge with it. Treatment of it is really interesting. There's been a lot of different varieties of treatment. The VA, Veterans Administration here in America, when they're treating their veterans, they will do things where they expose them to more and more stimulation that triggers their responses. And that's called exposure response prevention. And exposure response prevention can be effective depending on your definition of effective. It can create a cessation of symptoms, which is great and really nice. But it does that by moving the nervous system out of fight-flight into freeze. So we have three basic systems that come into play in trauma. There's fight, there's flight, and there's freeze. Fight and flight are actually relatively similar physiological experiences. And one thing you can do if you're nervous about something, for example, is you can convince yourself that you're excited or try to convince yourself that you're upset about it. And you'll find that the sensation associated with being upset is actually quite a bit more pleasant. But it's not actually that different from the sensation of anxiety or fear. It's just my interpretation of it changes and shifts, and my direction, it goes in a different direction for me. So that's actually a tip you can use sometimes if you ever have, I know you do cheer, if you have somebody with stage fright or something like that, you convince yourself that you're excited, and excitement is an emotion people won't typically associate with anger, but physiologically it's very similar, actually. It's just you don't feel like you're in threat when you're excited. You're anticipating a positive outcome. But it still has that same level of mobilization, is what we call it. So anger is a mobilizing emotion. Now, as a kid, if you get angry a lot in your family system, a lot of family systems will come down pretty hard on a kid. And so we learn very quickly to kind of stuff our anger. And that's, that has some merit to it, actually. I have a lot of folks who I train with who say, man, it's too bad about society and culture taking us out of our feelings and stuff. And I think that sounds awful. The last thing you want in a society and culture for things to work is everybody being in their feelings and expressing their real emotions. If you really understood what your own real emotions were, you certainly wouldn't want to hear everybody else's real emotions. I mean, human beings can be very primitive and not particularly kind. So I get nervous about the idea that we should somehow connect to that stuff. That said, it is a challenge, I think, at times to connect to the physical experience of anger, which is very mobilizing, versus the expression of anger in the world, which often people will equate with rage, right? Rage is a behavior. Anger is an emotion. And feeling the emotion can actually feel pretty good. So anyway, if we're talking about somebody who has a full immersion flashback, the VA approach will sort of bury them in that stuff again and again and again and again and again and again and again, which is just awful for them. And if they persist with it, eventually their symptoms will go away, but they'll feel a sense of deadness a lot of the time. They'll report a sense of flatness and that life has no, that everything in life is oatmeal. There's no more chocolate cake. And you feel for them. And, sometimes that's actually still a far cry better than what they had. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, because I would see this particular gentleman, it would start getting dark. And then, he's hiding behind the couch and he's and that was my thought of PTSD when we started talking about that. It was PTSD is only for people that were in war.
That's the common. Well, it's because of the Vietnam experience. Mm-hmm. It became much more well known following Vietnam. Although they had it after World War II too. They just called it shell shock. Mm. Right? They didn't have terminology for it. And PTSD as a diagnosis was vehemently opposed, actually, for many years. It was really a challenge for the field to decide there was such a thing, fascinatingly enough. Now, with Instagram and the other social media pieces, it's pretty well known and commonplace knowledge, but it was very, very resisted by the field that it was even a thing for a long, long time.
So full immersion, I can see that happening with war veterans, to go into that because it was so much part of their life. But then I have to think about domestic violence or, kids. Do you see that very often of people having those full immersion?
It doesn't come to my practice very much because if your nervous system is impacted to the point that you have full immersion flashbacks, it's very hard to function in the world.
I would think so.
Right. So because it's hard to function in the world, it's hard to seek out counseling and help. And sometimes family can help. But, a lot of times we're going to end up talking about somebody in that situation who's, homeless or just really, really struggling a lot of the time. Now, I certainly have seen it, and we do see it sometimes. It's just not particularly common. It's much more common to run into situations where people are having flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, intrusive memories, really, really terrible nightmares. A lot of the folks that I have in addiction recovery will struggle with nightmares. We will have folks who sometimes stop using their drugs or their alcohol and then start to experience some of those, the large-scale flashbacks. And that's a real challenge, right? So on the one hand, the consequence of my drug use is that I'm struggling to function in the world. On the other hand, if I stop, I have to experience these awful things, and there's no way out of them. Eventually, the fear of the flashback becomes just as immobilizing, or the fear of the nightmare.
Right.
These people who struggle with sleep, they fear sleep as much as anything else, and that's just a really tough spot to be in when you're afraid to go to sleep because of your flashbacks and your nightmares and stuff like that.
So if a certain smell or a song or something like that is going to trigger a memory.
Yeah.
Do you find it better? I mean, like what you're talking about with the VA of totally, just reenacting it or...
Man, that's one approach, but it's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's tough to just jump in there again and again and again. It does work eventually. The other challenge with that is it puts the system so freeze if you really understand the physiology behind the freeze response, it's more or less like a blanket or a brake being thrown over fight and flight. It doesn't stop the fight-flight system. So when you're in freeze, you don't feel like you're in fight-flight, but your nervous system is still stuck in that. And that's really damaging for the nervous system to have those levels of like cortisol and the other emergency hormones and adrenaline and all that stuff kind of coursing through them. So it doesn't bode well for your long-term physical health. Like the body breaks down after a while in that kind of a situation. So I tell people to avoid it if they can. For some people, it's the best option, but I really prefer, when we're talking about treatment for PTSD, one of the best treatments you can get are either EMDR in certain circumstances, which is this really interesting eye movement therapy. You move your eyes from left to right, and nobody really knows why it works. That's one interesting thing. EMDR, kind of like we were talking about PTSD, when I came into the field in the early 2000s, all the literature on EMDR had been written by, they had developed EMDR in the 90s, and it was not well received. I mean, if you think about having spent your academic career, you're getting a PhD on doing research and sort of mind-oriented things, and some lady comes in and says, I'm going to wave my fingers left and right for like 15 minutes and you're going to feel better. Like nobody in the field is going to be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Let's do that. It wasn't well received at all.
Right.
So EMDR shows up in the early 2000s, and it works and no one knows why. And we still haven't quite figured out why. We have some good theories, but the
like
process of bilateral stimulation, the best theory I've heard, Bessel van der Kolk, I don't think it's his, but he published it in a book called The Body Keeps the Score. Fascinating book about trauma. Very activating for a lot of people, though. It can be a hard one to read. But The Body Keeps the Score, he talks about the idea that something about the either bilateral stimulation, right? So I can put my hands on my shoulders, for example, and tap back and forth. And for whatever reason, that's fairly settling for a lot of people. Well, it turns out if I do that in the context of a traumatic memory or event, for some reason that allows for some processing to take place, at least some of the time, often a lot of the time. And the idea is that when I have a traumatic event, one of the things that happens, in theory anyway, is that the data from the trauma bypasses the part of the brain, the name of which escapes me because it's not really my specialty, neuroscience, but there's a part of the brain that's job is to basically make connections between sight and smell and sound and vision and all these other senses, right? All of our senses. And during a traumatic event, one of the things that happens is the system gets so overwhelmed that that part of the brain gets bypassed or goes offline. And the idea would be that the flashbacks are sort of the nervous system trying to get that thing organized and put it where it goes. And something about the bilateral stimulation or the back and forth eye movement allows for that process to happen and take place. And there's some thought about communication between the right and the left brain, between the part of the mind. The right brain is creative and doesn't really understand time and is very symbolic in terms of its processing and understanding, whereas the left brain is the part of us that we all think of as ourselves that very much understands time and organizes things and says, save some food for the winter, you'll starve to death, stuff like that. So those two parts of the brain kind of coming together seems to create a sense of settling. So EMDR is a great option for somebody with trauma. The challenge is it can be, the way it's executed can be very, very destabilizing and triggering some of the time. So if somebody has full immersion flashbacks, the EMDR thing, it really has to be done by somebody with a lot of experience in the field. I mean, they really need to have been doing EMDR for 10 or 15 years. If they're going to jump in there just because it's really easy to take it too far and kind of go the wrong direction with it. The other sort of common tool is called somatic experiencing, and that's the one that I've done a lot of my training in. And with somatic experiencing, what we do is we teach the nervous system on a sensory level, on a sensation level, how to resource and settle down a little bit. And the challenge of it versus EMDR is sometimes it takes a lot longer to see results. So if I had somebody, for example, with the kind of flashbacks we're talking about, you're really looking at a couple years usually. In my experience, there are people who are better at it than me, I'm sure, who can perhaps get results faster, but it's not uncommon for it to
It's
just
not easy,
be,
right?
well, you're looking at a nervous system that essentially imagine if you put too much electricity through a wire, right? The wire can't quite handle it and it just it fries. So we really have to take the amperage down a fair amount, and that or we install some thicker wires. And the installation process with regard to wiring, so to speak, to continue the metaphor, it takes some time. So a lot of times you spend a lot of time talking to somebody about their resources, what makes them tick, what do they like in life. Oh, you like your dog. Oh, tell me about your dog. What do you love about your dog? What do you notice when you talk about your dog? Oh, I feel kind of a little less tight here. I feel a little bit better. Oh, cool. Well, you have to be careful. If you take that too far, then that'll send you in the wrong direction too. So you tap into it for a second, you pull out, you tap in, you pull out. There's a real science to it that comes with just a lot of science and art to it that comes with a fair amount of practice. But that's the long and short of it in terms of how do you treat really, really acute PTSD. You look for resources and you try to add a little bit of resiliency within the system, and then you try to allow the system to process the material in whatever way works best for it. But no, I don't particularly prefer the exposure response prevention unless other options have been exhausted. And it's a shame too, because exposure response prevention is very, very measurable. And again, if the only thing you're looking at is the decrease in symptoms, it works. And it works not every time. It works a lot. But when you're done, it's not always awesome. What you're left with is often a sense of emptiness and just, I don't know how to describe it.
I like the oatmeal. The oatmeal.
Exactly. Oatmeal.
Metaphor. Yes, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Just bland oatmeal. And it's, as you're talking about that, I'm just reminded of the title of the podcast, Power of the Mind. And it's just amazing how, this is, one of those times where I'm just amazed at, the fight, flight, freeze, how your mind will work so hard to protect you, or, and how you can use different technique to get you somewhere, but you have to be so careful and you have to, it's amazing what you do to be able to work with these people, because it's fun. You have to be in that safe environment, and you have to be so responsible and so careful.
Well, yeah. And there is, it's just a blessing to get some good education. There are pioneers who've come in the field and have tried different stuff and who it's worked out for. There's a guy named Peter Levine who kind of figured out, he synthesized a bunch of different fields and a bunch of different areas and a bunch of different theories and put them together and developed this one. And he's been teaching it for 25 years, and it's kind of just taken off here in the last decade or so. And it's been an interesting thing to see, to understand how it works, and to see the nervous system as a system and to work with it on a nervous system level, on a sensation level. Our sensations actually inform our emotions, which then inform our thoughts. But if you think about it, when you have, for example, when you say, I'm anxious, well, what do you mean? What you really mean usually is you have a tightness in your chest or your throat, right? That's what or sometimes the pit of your stomach. It can be in different places. I feel ashamed. What do you mean? What you really mean is you have the sensation of a flushing in your face or a pit in your stomach. Like those are the sensation levels of things. And working with sensation and training the body that way can be very, very fruitful. And it can be remarkable when people are able to attune to it and move through it. So,
yeah, I've always been under the assumption, like, the brain is lazy. It'll do what you tell it to do, but it's also so delicate too. It's, when you put it through.
Well, the brain, an animal, for example, animals don't get PTSD. Well, why? They can actually occasionally. The domesticated animals can get PTSD, and it's possible to do it. But in nature, animals don't get PTSD. And one of the reasons, it makes sense, right? A gazelle that freezes when it sees a lion, oh my gosh, a lion, is just, now it's food. right? So animals that get PTSD don't make it very long, at least. We know that. Most animals don't get PTSD. Why? If I get chased by a lion and the lion almost catches me, okay, I get away, and then I will continue, and you'll see this with a Chihuahua. We have a bunch of Chihuahuas out here in Arizona, right? You pick up a Chihuahua, and it'll get so excited, it'll just shake. And it just shakes. Or it'll get mad. If it gets mad, it'll just, little thing's going to explode, right?
Right.
And that's all that activation coming out that little tiny nervous system, and it just shakes. And it doesn't have a cerebral cortex on board. Technically it does actually, I think, have a cerebral cortex on board, but it doesn't have a sense of self-consciousness on board that's like, man, I'm not going to be cool if I shake.
Right.
These people aren't going to be impressed with my Chihuahua-ness if I shake, right? It doesn't think that, it just shakes.
Right.
Well, a human being, and this, if you want to understand where PTSD comes from on a fairly sort of a basic, on a fundamental level, what PTSD comes from, we think anyway. In part, it has to do with, I go through something awful, and instead of allowing the body to just shake like the Chihuahua did, and also to have heat and tingling and cold and cry and shout and scream and yell, I think, man, I better not do any of that stuff. These people are not going to be okay with that. So instead, I remember coming on an accident one time up here in Prescott. I came around the corner and there was an accident, and there was a woman who had been in the accident. And nobody died or anything. One guy was still in the car, and the lady who had hit him had come out of the car, and the airbag had deployed. And it was a pretty good accident, but she was still ambulatory, still walking. And she was sitting on the corner, curled up, sitting up, but with her knees up to her chest, rocking and clenched. And what she was doing was trying not to shake. And I thought, I wanted to talk to her. I decided not to talk to her because she just had a big accident, and the cop was looking at me like, what are you doing, weird guy? I said, I'm a trauma therapist.
I'm Greg Struve.
I have some, I'm not trying to get in the way. I just, but I remember thinking, oh yeah, that's like a normal response to a traumatic event. People don't like it when their body does things without their permission following a traumatic, and sometimes it's not safe or smart too. In war, for example, right? In war, if you're a soldier and something awful happens just to your left and you want to run the other direction, you better not. There's a bunch of other guys in there who want you to not do that. So you can't follow your impulse. You can't do what your nervous system tells you to do. You can't do what your sensations tell you to do. You run toward the gunfire. That's a soldier. Like that's that override process kicks in, and the material in the nervous system, we think, just kind of stays there. And when we do somatic experiencing, a lot of what we're doing is allowing some of that material to leave. But you have to do that we used to think you could do it in a big chunk and it would work, but it didn't work. You have to do it in little tiny chunks and allow the system to do it on its own. You can't prompt it. You can, it just doesn't work as well. Right. So
by her fighting that shake, would you have, if you could have talked to her, would you have told her just let that go, or to feel it, be in the moment?
Yeah. Hey, notice what's happening in your body. Oh, it really wants to shake. Yeah. Notice the party that wants to brace for impact. Look at that. What would happen if you just let your forearms and your hands and your palms go out and brace for impact? Let's feel that party that wants to scream and shout. Feel that party that wants to call that guy a bunch of names. Feel that into the body. Allow that to be there for a minute.
So is that why, I don't even know if this is a connection, but when you're in a traumatic experience and you're trying to scream or you're trying to run and you just can't, you're just frozen. And
right. That's the freeze response.
Right.
And so that's what happens if you're if your nervous system concludes that fight, flight won't work, or if you conclude fight, flight won't work, freeze is the next best thing. Because sometimes if you go limp, the possum, right? The dog, there's a cool video I saw on YouTube, and it's a dog chasing a possum, and the possum does what possums do, falls down. It looks like it's got rigor mortis on it. Well, there's something in the dog's DNA that will not allow it to chase and get excited and attack and kill a dead thing. The DNA says, don't do that. That's a bad plan, which actually makes sense, right? You don't want the dog to bite into dead things. It's not good for animals to do that are predators. And so our nervous system understands that, and it will move us into playing possum. And oftentimes you'll be in a situation, particularly victims of sexual violence, when I'm working with them, almost every time they'll blame themselves, which is a function of they'll blame themselves, and there's some understandable reasons for that happening psychologically. Unfortunately, they'll do that, and one of the reasons will often be that because I didn't fight back. And for a lot of those folks, finding out about the freeze response and how the freeze response creates immobility in the nervous system, the first thing that go in your freeze response are your extremities, your arms and your legs. They just turn right off. Mm-hmm. You can't fight back if you want to. And often you'll dissociate. Okay, and then there's a part of the fight-flight response there's also a fawning response that's designed for pleasing and to try to not get killed. And that will show up sometimes too. And so it can be very complex and confusing for somebody who's been through that. But that information is often very helpful for somebody who's been through a rape or some other form of sexual trauma.
Well, yeah, or somebody who's watched it or something to where it's like, you're like, well, it wasn't my fault that I didn't run or help, or your brain went, oh no, we can't.
Yeah, witness trauma can actually be even more difficult to deal with. The nervous system response is very, very strong. Domestic violence, witnessing domestic violence, very common thing in my office, and it can have a really significant impact and be very challenging to deal with. In part because I don't believe I should be affected by it. Well, I saw it, but
it wasn't me, right?
Yeah, it didn't happen to me. That other person, man, they're the ones who really got it.
My granddaughter's going through that a little bit. We had at their apartment complex, a woman ran up on their door and was just pounding on the door. I need help. And, with my granddaughter, she's didn't really get to see the lady, so she doesn't know. She just knows that she needed help. And, my daughter was terrified to open the door because it's today, right? It's this day and age. And so my daughter's going through that regret. Like, if I had opened the door, maybe I could have helped her. And everything ended up being okay in the situation. The police were on the scene and stuff. And
right.
She was running from a bad situation. But for my granddaughter, 5 and 6 years old, she still talks about, she hears a loud noise. She's like, is that lady? Is she okay? So it was just interesting for her to just that one little experience. It's really, kind of stuck with her. So, we just tell her, she was okay. And, the police came and helped her and everything's okay. But she hears a loud noise. It's like,
Sometimes with a kid like that, sometimes you can have them play a little bit and play a game and play out the solution and play out the answer. And that can be really helpful. But yeah, it's really, really scary for a kid to have that happen. And our nervous systems are designed and wired to detect threat and to figure out what's the most threatening situation in the environment and then to adapt to it. So there's something about that still needs to be solved or answered for her.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm always like, I don't know how to fix this. It's just something, I just always think she'll grow out of it, or she'll forget about it. And,
more or less.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can offer some playful ideas about it. Grab a Barbie or some Barbies and say, okay, what do you think happened here? Whoa, look, somebody's knocking on the door. What do we do? And see how our little system responds. And, who do we bring in? Who's going to help? Well, let's have mommy help. Okay, great. Here's mommy's doll. What does mommy's doll do? And a lot of times she can, often without too much prompting, their systems. The other thing that's really interesting in trauma treatment you discover is that the nervous system almost always knows exactly what it needs to do to help itself. It's often very difficult to convince the self, for lack of a better term, to allow it to do it. Because it can be really unpleasant to remember or to allow the body to do whatever it needs to do, or to allow that kicking or punching or pushing to take place. You'll have clients push a wall sometimes if they need to activate that part of their nervous system. There's a lot of different stuff, but it's really easily apparent with kids who've been through, kind of a challenge is a lot of times in play. You'll just watch them and out it'll come.
Right. I've seen that too. It's, how they'll draw, their drawings or whatever.
Yeah, drawings are a good one.
Comes out through that.
Yep.
Interesting. And I'm always watching my granddaughters. Okay, still happy faces. All right. Everything's good. We're doing the right thing.
Oh yeah, you can have if you want to have a lot of fun, have them draw their family and see if there is one old exercise. You can have them draw their family, and the drawings will tell you a lot. Whether they have hands or feet is really important. It talks about agency, the ability to move. If there is a floor underneath, where everybody stands, right? You'll have a family system. You say, draw your family to the kid. And the kid will draw himself by 2 dogs and the rest of the family over on the other side. Well, that's where the kid sees himself in terms of the family symbolically, right? Wow. Or the mom is closer to dad, or mom's closer to me, and dad's closer to my sister, or whatever it is. Now, again, you have to be careful because if you do this at home, you can sort of end up deciding that your children are irrevocably damaged. I spend so much time with the parent shame. God bless them. You can't parent your kids perfectly. It's not possible. And parent shame probably causes more challenges than does good, for sure. It's one of the biggest challenges we have in the culture right now. Everybody's so obsessed with taking care of the kids that the kids don't ever have to overcome any adversity of their own. And so, anyway, that's a different discussion for another day.
I see it all the time.
But yeah, the thing with the drawing exercise, I haven't thought of that in years, but that's fun to do. If you're a therapist, you can really get neurotic about it with your own children. That's what I'm told anyway.
I should have my cheer team do it.
Do it. Have them do it. Yeah.
Draw your team. Like, here, Coach Alicia. I'll do it before I make them exercise.
Yeah. They'll draw themselves with tears coming out.
She's so mean. She made us exercise today. So, well, this has been interesting. This is, it's a lot of things. I like the freeze. I like that you're able to explain to people why they didn't react the way you think that you should have reacted. I think that's going to be very calming for people to hear that, that it's, gosh, I wanted to run or I wanted to fight and I just stood there. I couldn't do anything. And, I've often wondered why that happens, why, in every scary movie you see that, right? They're doing the wrong thing or they just can't move. But so that was interesting for me to hear that. I was like, okay, that makes, there's things that makes sense. So.
My favorite scary movie thing is that Geico commercial where the guys are all like, oh my gosh, somebody's coming after us. What should we do? Should we go over to that the running car that is unlocked and ready to go? No, let's go hide in this shed full of sharp tools. Chainsaws.
Yeah, you don't always make great decisions when you're scared to death, right? Oh, don't go in there.
I love the scary movie stuff. So.
But this was great. And PTSD definitely is not something that we can handle in, an episode or two. So I'm sure we're going to come back to that for sure. And but thank you so much for answering some of my questions. It is always my favorite part of the week. It's my therapy session. So I always appreciate that. And if you guys want to write in, you have questions, anything you'd like Greg to go over or answer, I know you're very honest when it's like, it's kind of out of my realm, but you always, try your best to kind of enlighten us on certain things. And I just really appreciate you and appreciate Power of the Mind. I'm learning a ton. So
good. I'm enjoying doing it too. And of course, anybody who wants to can check out Granite Mountain's website, granitemountainbhc.com, or you can contact me at gregstruve.com as well if you have questions or feedback.
Yeah, because you're just amazing. So I always feel like you're like in my head when we're talking. And I'll say things and I see your face go, I don't know what she's doing right now. So
I think, there are a series of patterns that you can pick up as a clinician, but I don't know. I think sometimes people put us up on a pedestal that's not necessarily, I don't know if I'm quite as psychic as you think I am, but
I'm just sure you've seen it so often. You've seen so many different cases of it that it's just.
I had a kid one time, I was driving an old Honda Civic. I drove that thing for 250,000 miles. It's a great car. And I pulled it into the parking lot one time and it made a squeak. And I parked it and I got out, and one of the clients at the treatment center I was at that time, he said, your power steering's leaking. I said, how do you know that? He said, I used to work on Honda Civics at this shop, and I grew up in a shop, and all we did was, because back in the day, the Honda Civic was apparently like the spiffiest racing car around. I wasn't using it for that by any means, but I had the one that I had the 2-door coupe, And he said, I've been doing this all day, every day, my whole life, and I just know what it sounds like. And I thought, that's kind of like what you do as a therapist eventually, is you get to a spot where you're like, oh, okay, I see this pattern. I've seen this before, so it makes sense. So I guess there is that. Yeah.
Everybody's an expert at something.
Well, let's hope anyway.
I'll figure mine out someday.
There you go.
We'll figure it out. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Power of the Mind with Granite Mountain Behavioral Healthcare. As always, if you want to reach out to Greg, we've got contact information, Granite Mountain BHC.
It's like behavioral healthcare, except it's just the letters.
I know. I just had to sound
Granite
it out real
Mountain
quick.
Behavioral Healthcare.com takes like 5 minutes to type. So we threw the BHC on the end.
GraniteMountainBHC.com.
Yeah.
Or GregStruve.com.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much, and we will see you next time on Power of the Mind.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye, guys.
If you have a question or something you'd like us to discuss here on Power of the Mind, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is stories, STORIES, at signalsaz.com. That's stories, STORIES, at signals, SIGNALS, AZ.com. Look forward to hearing from you.